Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7, putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
Over the last 2 weeks, the nation has witnessed the third set of impeachment hearings in modern history. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. A series of current and former administration officials have testified before the House Intelligence Committee as the country moves closer to the impeachment of President Donald Trump. Some of those spectacular testimony came from the U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, who said, quote, "Everyone was in the loop when it came to a presidential meeting and military aid in exchange for investigations by Ukraine in the 2016 presidential elections and former Vice President Joe Biden." Take a look at the events over the last 2 weeks. We have on the phone Jeremy Venook. He is a research analyst with the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. Here in the studio, our local Republican, John Bartkovitch, also from Salisbury University political science professor Michael Laughlin, and associate professor political science Adam Hoffman, chair of the political science department. Welcome to you all.
Good morning.
Morning. Morning.
So, Jeremy, I want to start with you and get your overall impression of what we saw over the last 2 weeks.
I mean, from what I have seen over the last 2 weeks, I managed to fit in all of the impeachment hearings, managed to watch every hearing start to finish, and it's really remarkable how open and shut this case is. There was a lot of questioning of language, of bribery, extortion, quid pro quo. Would those words actually be used? And what you had in Ambassador Sondland coming forward on Wednesday morning was him very explicitly laying it out. He said there was a quid pro quo. The president was offering a White House meeting in exchange for these investigations that he wanted, this meddling in the 2020 election, and on top of that, him saying that everyone was in the loop. It was an open question just how involved the rest of the Trump administration was, and he was basically playing 6 degrees of political Kevin Bacon up there. He was sitting there and saying, here's the email I sent to Mick Mulvaney. Here is the email that I sent to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Here is when I told Vice President Mike Pence about this scheme, and really that he effectively got, if not sign off on, then tacit approval from all of them to be going and conducting this shadow Ukraine foreign policy, this quid pro quo on the president's behalf.
Well, one of the Republicans' arguments has been that they do not see, at least as far as they're concerned, a directive by the president to say, go ahead and do this. And then obviously they talk about, I believe it was the September 9th comment to Sondland, which he says there's no quid pro quo. In short, from an evidentiary point of view, the Republicans seem to be saying, in fact, we don't see a direct connection between the president and this scheme.
I mean, that's the thing that Sondland, I thought, completely blew out of the water. He effectively said, President Trump repeatedly told Volcker, told the people who were in charge of, again, this shadow policy, this quid pro quo, that he was running things through Rudy Giuliani, to go talk to Rudy about what they wanted to do. And everybody, over and over, testified. David Holmes testified to it, Gordon Sondland testified to it, Kurt Volker testified to it. They all understood that this was being directed straight from the president. And on top of that, we don't have to analyze his state of mind. We don't have to, try to intuit things. Trump himself has said, both on that July 25th phone call and in that October appearance on the White House lawn, that what he wanted was for the Ukrainian government to open investigations into the Bidens and into this conspiracy theory that actually it was secretly the Ukrainian government that was behind election interference in 2016.
By the way, turning away from Trump for a moment, what do you make of the way that Ukrainian diplomacy was carried out? We saw Fiona Hill suggest that there were 2 tracks, as it were, but there seems to be a lot of just sort of like ricocheting around of people having bits and pieces of what's going on. And how do you see that impacting, for instance, what the Ukrainians were seeing from their point of view?
Yes, there were 2 separate channels going. There was what Bill Taylor described as the regular channel and the irregular channel. But it sounds from the weight of the testimony that by the time this scheme, this quid pro quo, bribery, extortion. Again, I think all three words are an accurate descriptor based on what we've heard. The Ukrainians understood what was going on. They knew that aid had been withheld. They were given the message by multiple people, most notably, of course, Gordon Sondland, but also it sounds like Rudy Giuliani, Kurt Volker, that if they wanted the White House meeting first and later, if they wanted the aid released, that they had to deliver on these investigations, and Zelensky was prepared to do it. He was scheduled to go on CNN to speak with Fareed Zakaria and make this announcement that Donald Trump repeatedly said that he wanted.
In terms of Ukrainian policy, do you think this affects Ukrainian policy going forward in the future? I mean, obviously, a lot of it's going to depend on who becomes the next president of the United States, whether it's Trump or someone else. The military aid seems now to be in the fix, as it were, which obviously cannot be a happy thing for the folks in Moscow. Where do you see as we try to project forward?
I think that this absolutely is going to impact our relationship with not just Ukraine, but with other foreign governments as well going forward. Ukraine now has to fundamentally question whether the U.S. government's provision of aid, whether it's support in this ongoing hot war with Russia that they have on their eastern front, can be counted on, or whether they're just going to continue to be used as a political football. And I think that we heard from several people, again, Ambassador Yovanovitch spoke to this, Bill Taylor, George Kent, Fiona Hill, speaking about the extent to which this is going to call into question the U.S.'s broader pro-democracy, anti-corruption pushes around the world. And that, Kurt Volker, as he testified, was explicitly asked when he said to his Ukrainian counterpart, don't pursue these politicized investigations. The response was, oh, you mean like the investigations you are asking us to do into Trump's political opponents? Like the investigations, the corrupt scheme that you are pushing in order to dig up dirt on the president's rivals?
Michael Laughlin?
I'd like your reflections on where the Republicans are at this point. It seems as if they're really no longer contesting the case itself. They've moved to the position of saying that yes, but it's of minimal importance. This is not an impeachable offense, and I'm struck by it seems to me some of the contradictions that they get themselves involved here with. On the one hand, they think that Bill Clinton should have been thrown out of office for lying about a sex affair. But on the other hand, they're saying this doesn't rise to the level of impeachment, nor they seem to imply, additionally, that even Richard Nixon probably shouldn't have been forced out of office. What are your reflections on where the Republicans are at this point with regard to that?
I think that's exactly right. It was really striking how there were effectively two parallel threads going on in the questioning by Republicans, by their lawyer. There was the one thread where they weren't contesting any of the facts that were being laid out. They weren't questioning, was there a quid pro quo? They weren't questioning, was there this exchange of a White House meeting for investigations into Trump's political opponents? But at the same time, they were acting as if they hadn't heard any of the testimony. There were multiple times where they explicitly contradicted the actual things that witnesses had said, even just an hour or two before during the hearing. And maybe the one that I found the most disappointing was Will Hurd, who has styled himself as a moderate, who has styled himself as somebody who goes with the facts, who is swayable, who basically came out and said at the end of the hearing, I do not see anything in this that amounts to bribery, that amounts to extortion, that amounts to a quid pro quo. A little more than 24 hours after a witness sat directly in front of him and said to him, this amounts to a quid pro quo. This is extortion. This is bribery.
Adam?
Just moving a little bit towards another topic of whether or not or how this affects the public. We were just talking a moment when we were off air about the polling, whether or not the results of at least the hearings in the House sway at all the electorate towards supporting impeachment or opposing impeachment going forward. Now that we're going to move to the Senate phase, what's your prediction? How do you think, if at all, the polls are going to move significantly, especially when it comes to the all important group of the independents moving in either into the pro or opposed to impeachment camp?
Poll watching I wouldn't say is my strong suit, but one thing that I think is notable is more than half of the country believes that this impeachment investigation should move forward. This has been the consistent finding of polling really since it was announced, since we saw the transcript of Trump's call with Zelensky. More than 50% of the country believes that this impeachment investigation and this trial should move forward. And what I'm expecting to see is we might see a rehash of this testimony, but based on what we've seen from people like Lindsey Graham and others, I would expect to see an even more concerted attempt than we've already seen to muddy the waters. Just last night, Lindsey Graham, who prior to the Trump administration had nothing but positive things to say about Joe Biden, basically announced that his Judiciary Committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, was going to be moving forward with an investigation into what, again, just a day or two before, witnesses for the Republicans said in trials, in the hearings, were conspiracy theories about Joe Biden. So I would not be surprised to see a much more concerted effort to muddy the waters and to try to make it as confusing for the general public as possible what is actually going on and what Trump actually did.
John?
Jeremy, first my condolences for your having to watch the entire impeachment presentation. I don't know how you did it. I hope you got more bladder breaks than they did. In any case, Jeremy, looking forward to the Senate side of this, if you say, as a Republican, I say the first half was all Democratic, is it not unfair to say that the second half will be all Republican?
I don't think it's accurate to say that the first half of these impeachment hearings, if this was in fact the first half, was all Democratic. You had several people who were nonpartisan officials, who are career diplomats. You had people like Jennifer Williams, who is a career Republican who worked on campaigns, who works in the vice president's office. You had people like Gordon Sondland, who was a donor to Trump's inaugural, and Kurt Volker and Tim Morrison, who were requested by Republicans on the House Intelligence Committee. So I don't think it's accurate to say that the first half of these investigations were, in fact, all Democratic. And I'm not saying that the Senate trial would, in fact, be all Republican, but I would not be surprised if, again, Lindsey Graham has signaled that he is willing to do more of the conspiracy theorizing in his committee to call people like Hunter Biden and Joe Biden to investigate what, again, was explicitly described in the hearings as a conspiracy theory.
Can I just follow with a quick question, Jeremy? Does that then, if the last two previous impeachments were bipartisan, does the fact that we had this first half, or the inquiry, which was really sort of Democratic, and the trial, which is going to be Republican, does it make it less bipartisan and therefore less likely to take place as an impeachment?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by it, less likely to take place as an impeachment, but this question of partisan or bipartisan, partisanship isn't just some natural thing that floats out there in the ether. It was a decision by the Republican Party to push back entirely against these investigations from the beginning, to begin during the depositions, which are a pretty routine phase of any investigation, by claiming that this process was all wrong. They're trying to keep things secret. They weren't, in fact, trying to keep these things secret. To have the storming of the skiff led by Matt Gaetz, and including people who were allowed to be part of that investigation, part of that committee. The question about partisanship versus bipartisanship, we need to acknowledge that these aren't things that just float out there in the ether, that there are active decisions being made to try to turn this into a partisan affair.
Let me ask you this: how do these impeachment process, do you think, compare in terms, particularly in terms of partisanship, with, say, the situation with Nixon? Which I remember covering the hearings, the great debate about what Nixon should be charged with, and there were Republicans who certainly supported Richard Nixon and went after some of the individual issues, particularly specificity. In the case of someone like Bill Clinton, it was far more partisan. We came very close, by the way, I think, with the Iran-Contra affair, in which there was an investigation, but they fell short of that. But even when I watched those hearings, I found that while certainly Republicans defended the president, tried to get at some of the issues, there was much more reasonable interchange, I think, between all of the people on the dais and the witnesses. This one seems to be much, much different. So I sort of laid that out there for you. How do you make the comparison? How do you see this?
I have to admit that I was not actually around for the state hearings. But one of the things that to me is a big difference is the media and political environment in which that took place versus in which this took place. And, Roger Ailes, who invented Fox News, he explicitly did so after Watergate, after he had worked for Nixon, as a media outlet to advance right-wing causes. This isn't, some speculation on my part. This is well documented. And I think that what we're seeing is, there's a feed of Fox News up in the studio in which I'm recording this, and the video that's going on up there and that's been going on up there is completely different than what I witnessed actually sitting through those impeachment hearings. It's a lot of talk about who is the whistleblower, what did Hunter Biden do, who is Alexandra Chalupa. I admit that I have had to repeatedly remind myself who is Alexandra Chalupa because it's not something that is actually relevant to these impeachment hearings.
And Michael?
Let me shift, Jeremy, to the institutional question. That is, do you think, just straight up, do you think that these hearings, whatever the fate of the articles of impeachment in the Senate, do you think that these hearings have strengthened Congress overall in terms of its institutional power, or is it possible that it undermines it or weakens it?
I think that's really a question that will only be answered when we see what the actual results of the impeachment vote and then afterward the impeachment trial happen. What we could end up seeing is a strong reassertion of congressional power, of their authority to oversee the president, or what we could see if the trial goes off the rails in the Senate is basically a further retreat by Congress, a further embrace of President Trump's apparent belief, and this is something that he himself has said, that Article 2 of the Constitution gives him effectively absolute power over the federal government to do as he pleases without really anybody to check him.
Let me just get this. I'll follow up this. Do you think that what's happened here in part is that, originally the Constitution had, first article was about Congress, which was viewed to be supreme. Second one, obviously, was the executive. Have we now come to the point where those two articles have now been reversed in terms of power?
I think that's definitely one way of putting it, that Article 2 has kind of acceded over Article 1 in terms of authority. And this has been, a long creep in U.S. governance. This has been, you can go back and you can debate when exactly it started, whether it was, the Gulf of Tonkin Revolution, whether it was the New Deal, whether it was, going all the way back to, the Civil War. You can continually argue when was it that the presidency started to have this creeping power where it took on more and more power as Congress receded and receded. But I think that's certainly what we're seeing in real time.
Adam?
So following up on that line of discussion, don't you think a lot of it has to do with, the individual people that serve in these positions? In other words, the power of Congress definitely got a surge and, increased its sort of central role when Newt Gingrich took over the House in 1992, sort of reasserting the power of Congress. And then, of course, Trump and the extension of the imperial presidency. So do you think, the change in the relative power of these two branches is largely impacted by who serves in those two branches?
Absolutely, and that's why I say that I don't think we'll really have an answer to this question until we see what ends up happening with the impeachment vote if it moves to a trial in the Senate, which is we could either see this end up with the Senate enforcing its duties with people like Lindsey Graham, Chuck Grassley, of course on the Democratic side, Chuck Schumer, really actively taking the power that the Constitution grants them, or we could see them continuing to relinquish power to the executive branch by not wielding the authority that they, as Congress, are designated by the Constitution.
John?
Yeah, Jeremy, I want to turn back to the concept of Fox News versus the media. Has that come on because the media has generated the differences between conservative and liberal, or is it liberal and conservatives have gotten to the point where they have created the need for a liberal media and a conservative media? Do you understand my question? In other words, which came first, the separation of ideas or the Fox versus fake news?
I do understand what you're getting at, but I'm not sure that I have ever seen anything on the left that really resembles what we see, not just with Fox News, but even further right into the right-wing infrastructure, places like OANN, places like, of course, Breitbart. Not saying that, obviously, there is a direct connection between Fox News and Breitbart, but the things that are often brought up as the left-wing analogs to Fox News, places like MSNBC, whose morning show is anchored by Joe Scarborough, a former Republican member of Congress. Places like the New York Times, which has a whole roster of conservative analysts on its staff that I don't think you see in any kind of similar manifestation at places like Fox News. So I don't think that it's a kind of natural sorting. I think that there is an active effort to create a right-wing media infrastructure, and I think that we've seen a lot of success on that front.
I want to turn to some politics here because if we look at the Senate, some of the folks that may be questionable on the Republican side, we'll see, is Mitt Romney and also Susan Collins. Both Mitt Romney has been obviously a critic of the president, and Susan Collins has been a critic and sometimes seems as if she's leaning towards the moderate side of this. How do you see this playing out? Do you see any Republicans that might say, I got to do this, or is the politics so strong that if you're a Republican senator, you just don't need the problems?
I think that there are really multiple questions at play in that question, one of which is which Republicans are up for re-election, which Republicans are potentially retiring after this term. I really do think that somebody like Susan Collins, who comes from a state that prides itself on independence, that prides itself on not necessarily sorting directly into the political camps that they ascribe to the rest of the country in Maine, the fact that she is, I believe, up for re-election in 2020, but her coming from a state that prizes itself on that, independent identity could put cross pressures on her that you don't necessarily see on people whose seats are safer. One big question is, how much does Trump kind of try to hug these senators to him? How much does he try to, as he did, for example, in these gubernatorial elections that we just saw over the last month, as he tried to do in 2018, to make the election and the impeachment and everything that the Senate and the House do about himself? And if we see an active effort to do that, then that could potentially influence those votes. Another way, if we don't see that, then not just necessarily Susan Collins, but also people like Cory Gardner, they're in vulnerable seats and may see it as important to take this vote that will basically do as much to distance themselves from President Trump as any vote reasonably could.
John, you had another question?
No, I'm going to follow up on that because Mitt and Collins, if in fact they have a desire to vote for or against Trump, I think Mitch McConnell might be of the notion that go ahead, because we got enough votes without you 2 or 3 or 4 or 10. So there is the potential that there may be some Republican senators that say, I really feel like maybe, okay, Mitch says I got all the votes I need, do what you feel best for your particular situation. Because Senator Collins, I would rather have you back here next cycle than whoever your candidate that you're running against. Mitt Romney, same thought. Mitt Romney may say, I can't vote for this, or I will vote for impeachment, and can do it safely because there are enough backup votes that Mitch McConnell will say, feel free, we're not going to bang on you.
But
And-
no, but on the other hand, Mitch McConnell. On the other hand, another strategy would be to keep the Republican Party completely together, because even losing just a few Republican votes will allow Democrats to say this is a bipartisan.
So like the two Democrats that voted not to have the inquiry.
Right.
That makes it bipartisan against the inquiry?
Well, but no,
to be
bipartisan,
different.
bipartisan in favor of impeaching Trump. In other words,
okay.
all they'll need is 3 or 4 to make that claim to a lot of Americans. So, in other words, Mitch McConnell is kind of between a rock and a hard place. I'm
So
not
I can
sure
make that
which
argument
strategy.
about the inquiry, to say that it was bipartisan against the inquiry. The Congress was in a bipartisan state against the inquiry, yet it went forward. No, I'm just, it's 2 votes.
As a matter of fact, a couple of votes. That's how they always cover it.
okay.
Not only in this instance.
I'm sorry, Jeremy, we got carried away.
Mike,
Just to circle back to the hearings one more time, one of the things that struck me was that I thought perhaps the Democrats could have made a stronger argument with regard to the what was at stake. The notion of meddling in our elections is one phrase that always struck me as being somewhat superficial, that it really is a question of violating the sovereignty of American citizens and our voting, so that what Trump, and this always tied together the Mueller, of course, the results of the Mueller report with these hearings, is really that the seriousness rises above what Nixon did, and certainly rises above what Bill Clinton did. And that really strikes at the fundamental heart of what a democratic polity is, and that is the sovereignty of our elections, that we determine who our officials are going to be. I wonder, do you have a similar kind of reflection on that?
Yes, I do. And I would say that to me was in part a manifestation of which witnesses the House was able to call, which witnesses were willing to defy the White House's orders and comply with the congressional subpoenas, which, they were legally required to do effectively, but many refused to do so anyways. And the people who ended up being willing to testify were people who could speak to the foreign policy aspect, who could speak to the importance of this aid to Ukraine. But I do really think that it's incredibly important that, especially after 2016, where there remain large questions about the extent to which Russian interference may have influenced people's votes, I think it's incredibly important that the American public understand that what Trump was fundamentally doing was not simply bribery, not simply extortion, not simply quid pro quo, but it was directly aimed at undermining the 2020 election and its integrity. It was directly aimed not at investigating corruption, as his defenders like to claim that he wanted to do. I've never seen anything from this president that makes me think he actually cares about corruption. But this was about weaponizing investigations against who he considers the front runner to be his 2020 rival. And that's something that, he did all through 2016. It's a familiar playbook for him, and he very clearly wanted to run it again. And he very clearly wanted the government of Ukraine, and, we've seen the government of China. We don't even know what other governments he may have tried to pull into this team, but he also asked the Chinese government to investigate his political opponent.
let me just, before we cap off here with you, Jeremy, there's also Ukraine and at least some op-eds and some efforts by some of the Ukrainians, or certainly expressions by Ukrainian officials during the 2016 election, in which they were not certainly happy with Trump. We had Alexander Chalupa, you mentioned a moment ago, who was a consultant, for the DNC, involved with that as well. She's of Ukrainian descent and was aware certainly of what was going on in the Ukrainian community, and i.e. certainly Paul Manafort's name had come up within that community. What do you make of the arguments that they made, particularly Nunes, that there was an effort by Ukraine to influence the election against Donald Trump? Obviously, we're not successful, but nonetheless, there is a certain foreign influence that's playing out there.
I think that's a bit of a false equivalency.
Yeah.
I think that multiple witnesses testified that, again, the idea that there was a concerted Ukrainian effort to interfere was effectively a conspiracy theory. Sure, you could point to scattered events. You could point to an op-ed criticizing Trump's stance on Crimea, effectively suggesting that he might consider relinquishing it to Russia. But that is not at all equivalent to what Russia did. And I would just add, what Trump said on that July 25th phone call was not, well, you know, Alexandra Chalupa and Ambassador Chali, those weren't the things he brought up. He brought up a total out-of-left-field conspiracy theory about that the DNC actually sent its servers to Ukraine to hide something about the truth about what happened in 2016. That is a mutually exclusive understanding of the 2016 election from the understanding that Russia hacked it.
And just
You have
briefly,
to
yeah.
invent effectively a completely different thing that Donald Trump was trying to say and wanted to have investigated in order to square it with the concept that there could have been both Ukrainian meddling and Russian meddling in the 2016 election.
Finally, what do you make of the fact that the DNC and by extension, obviously, the Clinton administration contracted to get information about Donald Trump abroad, which was sort of resulted in the now famous dossier? I remember, I believe it was in the hearings, that a couple of the State Department people, I think it was the last group, was asked whether that was appropriate, and they said no, they did not think that was appropriate. What about that idea of, aside from governments doing this, that campaigns are reaching outside the United States to other governments, to other sources, to gather information on their opponents?
I would probably agree that I think it's something a campaign shouldn't necessarily do. But again, I think that there's a fundamental difference between those actions, between hiring a person who, in their efforts to, you know, get a fuller picture of the opposition candidate or something along those lines, speaks with people who are in foreign countries, versus actively asking a foreign government to open an investigation, to announce the opening of an investigation. We don't even have any reason to believe that Trump wanted any more than that announcement into your political opponents, or to do what happened in 2016, which was a foreign government actively attacking American democracy, and the Trump campaign effectively going along with it, maximizing the effects of that attack by coordinating with WikiLeaks and things like that.
We've been speaking with Jeremy Venook. He's a research analyst with the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C. Jeremy, appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So let's turn to our studio folks here inside, because I'm sure they have plenty of opinions. But I just want to remind people, it seems to me as I sort of looked at this in terms of how it played out, the hub of all of this in terms of trying to understand what people were doing was that July 25th, 2019 phone call between the president and the president of Ukraine. And there are two segments that I'll go through real quick, and then we'll sort of go around robin. After Zelensky says, we really need the javelins, and we're ready to take them on, the president says, I would like you to do us a favor, though, because our country has been through a lot, and Ukraine knows a lot about it. I would like you to find out what happened with this whole situation with Ukraine. They say CrowdStrike. I guess you have one of the wealthy people, the server. They say Ukraine has it. There are a lot of things that went on the whole situation. And then later on he turns to Biden. He says, one other thing. There's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so you can look into that. It sounds horrible to me. And it seems to me that when we're trying to find out why everybody is running around doing the things that they're doing, right? It seems to me that becomes the hub from which everything else becomes a little bit clearer in terms of why people are doing the things that they're doing. I'll start with you, John. That was like the central thing that's sort of like, okay, we did, everybody's saying, well, but somebody's heard this and somebody heard that, right? So, but then I say, well, but where's the primary document? And it seems the primary document is this document. However you decide to interpret it, seems to indicate
and that's part of the issue.
Right?
That's part of the issue. We've actually seen the transcript that I don't think anybody really expected Trump to produce. Having produced that, there still appears to be at least two separate interpretations of what he said. And that's, one side says, well, what he said is quid pro quo, if you don't do this, blah, blah, blah. The other side says, well, you can say that if you want, but in fact, all the things that were supposed to get done, i.e. the javelins take place, he gets a meeting with me, nothing ever was done in terms of really saying, if you don't do this, I'm not going to do that, because all those things subsequently got done. And that's, am I sort of making myself clear? In other words, he said, we're not going to send you money unless you do some certain things for us. He never did any of those things, and yet still got everything that was said he was holding back. Am I?
Right. No, I understand. Let me just follow one other thing here, which is that this phone call that occurred, I guess, was the day after, in which the president is talking to Sondland, right?
Right.
And David Holmes, the Ukrainian diplomat, says, I heard the president say, talk about investigations, but then afterwards, which is probably the most vivid thing that he remembers, he says, I then took the opportunity to ask Ambassador Sondland for his candid impression of the president's views on Ukraine. Particularly, I asked Ambassador Sondland if it was true that the president didn't give a blank about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland agreed that the president did not give a blank about Ukraine. He says, I asked why not. The Ambassador Sondland stated that the president only cares about big stuff. I noted there was big stuff going on in Ukraine, like the war with Russia. Ambassador Sondland replied that he meant big stuff that benefits the president, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani is pushing. Now, by the way, Sondland denies realizing that Burisma was connected to Biden, so there's some dispute about that. So here now you have this follow-up here.
Sondland in the morning he says there's a quid pro quo. In the afternoon he says, Trump told me there is no quid pro quo. Just so Sondland is not. He went both sides on the.
Although the no quid quo, that particular comment,
it was my interpretation
on
of
September 9th. On September 9th, which is the point at which all this stuff begins to come to public.
But I mean, there's an example of what was said in the morning, changed in the afternoon. It ends up being a nothing.
Mike, what do you think about all this?
I think.
Did I overstate it, Mike? I'm sorry.
No, you stated with absolute clarity, but it's incorrect.
Well, there you go.
Well, I'm clearly incorrect there.
Yes,
but articulate.
The evidence. I think that the overall set of hearings with 9 witnesses corroborated. The overwhelming evidence indicates that this president tried to extort an action, a set of investigations of the Ukraine government, in order for them to get military assistance and to get this much prized meeting with the president. The evidence, despite Donald Trump's statement, the evidence overwhelms that statement and shows that statement to be a lie. And I think there's absolute evidence that this president also lies a lot too. So there's no reason to believe him, in spite of the overwhelming circumstantial evidence of the case.
Or the facts, like they got the javelins, he had the meeting, and
correct.
there
After
was
he got
no
caught.
investigation.
No, after he got caught. After he got caught. That's correct.
Let me get Adam in here.
I'm sorry, Adam.
No, that's okay. No, I mean, I think, look, the Republicans want you to focus on narrow things like the phone call, like whether or not it was quid pro quo. But, I mean, Mike is right. When you look at the, all the overwhelming evidence, you see exactly what the Trump policy was. And remember, Jeremy was, I want to correct a little bit of what Jeremy was saying, because, I mean, one of the things that came up in the hearings was that it wasn't a rogue policy. It wasn't an alternative policy. Everyone, Sondland and others testified that everyone was in the loop. Mike Pompeo, Nick Mulvaney, basically. This was Trump policy, to bribe a foreign government with congressional appropriated funds in order to get what he wanted. In other words, to use his public office for that private gain. That was one of the things that came out, I think, with Fiona Hill's testimony and other people, basically, that everyone was in the loop. Yes, Giuliani was sort of pushing everyone to change U.S. foreign policy to reflect what Trump wanted to do. But I think Mike's right. You have to move beyond just that phone call and look at sort of the whole picture of what people testified about. One other thing I'll add, though, that we haven't brought up yet. I mean, all these crazy conspiracy theories that were spun by Giuliani, so many of those were fueled by Vladimir Putin and Russian intelligence, which makes, just a tremendous amount of sense that, they wanted to deflect the role that they played in interfering in the 2016 election by blaming the country that they're at war with, Ukraine. And they precisely did that, and Rudy Giuliani bought it, and Donald Trump bought it, and so did a lot of other people in his administration. So I think that's an important element in too.
Chuck, by the way, Chuck, what about this idea that a lot of the conspiracy theories that we're seeing that we're playing out, particularly the crowd strike stuff, the idea that the Ukrainians had these servers, that they were influencing the election. The fact that it does emanate, certainly reflects, but probably emanates from Moscow. Does that bother you at all? This idea that we're fooling, as opposed to
we're going back to another. It's the Russians. We're going to bring Mueller back from the grave and let him start again and spend another 3 years and $32 million.
I'm not sure we ever buried him, but that's okay. Nonetheless, but I mean, is there? I mean. It does seem. I mean, go ahead. I mean, it does seem as there's this reflection. Whether so the president believes this, right? I mean, that's the.
So we're going to give up. We're getting ready to give up on quid pro quo, and we're going to go back to Russian collusion. Is that what I'm kind of getting?
No,
here?
I'm just kind of curious about. I'm just curious about, because one of the impetus, it seems to me, one of the impetuses for what the president was asking was in regards to these conspiracy theories, which seem to reflect at least what the Russians were trying to put out. So here you have a president of the United States buying into this particular conspiracy theory. That makes me uncomfortable. But that's beside the point.
Hold on. So
what about that?
The president is subjected to the Steele dossier. That was so false, an attack, and then he's subjected to 2.5, 3 years of Russian collusion, and then that sort of goes away when Mueller bombs out for that argument. And so now we've come to this quid pro quo, and that's the latest thing. And again, that's, no offense, guys, but it looks like it's bombing out to me. If it doesn't bomb out before it gets to the Senate, it will when it gets there. So I think he has felt all along that he has been subjected to inappropriate attacks from all kinds of places, from his point of view. He sees it from the Clinton campaign, he sees it from the Russians, he sees it from the Ukrainians. And Paul Manafort is carried away because of his contacts with Ukraine from Chalupa. So, I mean, he sees this as this background, and he said, I'm going to make sure that the American people see this problem in our government where we are affected. As president, I am challenged by people who've made up stuff.
And it doesn't bother you that maybe this one particular conspiracy is just made up?
Well,
that he believes in?
No, I think he really.
I think it's a mindset.
No,
it's a mindset.
No, I really think he believes there was some Ukrainian input into the 2016 election,
including the server.
The server, I'm
Okay,
sure.
okay,
I'm sure there are many.
I won't put you on the
Hold
spot.
on. There are many people who would like to see the server. I'd love to see that server.
Somehow I don't think it's in Ukraine. But go ahead,
No,
Michael.
it was bleach bitten. They beat it with hammers. It's gone.
It's gone. That's right. Go ahead, Mike.
Let me I want to unpack just a bit more of the significance of what the investigations that Trump wanted were about in terms of the politics of this. I mean, here we have the president extorting this government to do an investigation into the Bidens, his domestic political opponent, and in an effort clearly to smear Joe Biden, if Joe Biden were to be the nominee, Trump would have in hand. He'd say, "Well, look at this government. Ukraine has doing this investigation of the Bidens because they are corrupt, and we can't have a corrupt president." So clearly there's no evidence to indicate that this investigation is warranted. Indeed, I think that I'd go even further, that Trump actually did not want the investigation to go forward, because if it in fact had, and revealed that there was nothing that would clear Biden, then that would be worse, right? It's better to have it in the air as a smear going forward. So I think that what's revealed here and is a corrupt president. This is as Elizabeth Warren has put it, he's corruption in the flesh. There were no borders. So there's no, he will go beyond the pale in order to smear his opponents using and abusing the powers of the presidency. So whether or not he believes any of these conspiracy theories, it's largely irrelevant. He's willing to use them to smear his opponents, to violate the law, and to corrupt the presidency.
So, like using Biden's own words, that if you don't fire the prosecutor, you're not going to get the $100 billion. That's using Biden's own words. That's you don't. That, I interpret that as
Okay,
that may be corruption.
Let me respond.
Yeah.
In that context, Joe Biden, was the Vice President of the United States, was speaking to American policy, the government's policy. There was no political benefit for him in that process. Clearly, Trump, in his articulation for these investigations, has nothing to do with the advancement of American policy.
Where does American policy come from? Does it come from the president?
John, I didn't interrupt you.
I'm sorry. Forgive me. No, I'm just sorry. Forgive me. Forgive me.
That clearly Trump was interested in his own election for the 2020 election. There was no public policy motivation there. It's quite distinct difference.
And you need to separate those two things. I mean, that's very important. Every single elected official realizes it. This is why there's a rules, there are walls that you put up when you're an elected official for making policy, for doing things that are policy oriented, and a separate space for running the campaign. Every single elected member of Congress, every single president, realizes that basically. And Trump, for some reason, does not realize that. He could have very easily, look, Oppo research is done all the time. He could have very easily, basically, had a campaign, invited American consultants to dig up dirt on his opponents. This is what people who are running campaigns all the time. But the difference was he used the powers of this public office to do that, and that you cannot do. This is what the founding fathers, warned us against, a president exactly like Trump.
Let me just refer to Senator Lindsey Graham, because he's going to open up this investigation, Joe Biden and Biden's son. And we mentioned races, I think, in one of the previous shows, but is it appropriate to investigate this and say, well, there looks like there's some really strange things going on with the fact that the Hunter got some benefit from it and so on. Maybe we should take a look at whether there are these previous... Adam, do you think that's an appropriate use of congressional inquiry and inquiry in general? Maybe we should know more.
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, I think something like that, combines both the political and the policy. I mean, clearly Graham is doing that as a favor for Trump. Clearly Graham is choosing out of every single bit of corruption in every single country, including Ukraine. That's the one thing he's focusing on. Coincidence? I doubt it.
Because it seems to me that if we have this, and it's occurred to me when I read this, it's like, well, maybe we should have hearings on the Trump kids. Michael. Then we've got to. John.
I think given the fact that there's no evidence that Biden's son has done anything wrong, and that this is pro forma for economic elites, both Republicans and Democrats.
Sure.
This is not.
This happens all the time.
It happens all the time. Now, having said that, I always like Carl Sagan's notion that the absence of evidence, not the evidence of absence, right? So there could be a corruption within Burisma and Joe and
Hunter Biden.
And Hunter Biden, there could be, but our politics, given as charged it is, that's not the function of Congress at this point in time. It may be the function of academics, perhaps, investigative journalists. I think journalists have every right and maybe an obligation to say, yeah, let's investigate what Ivanka's doing in China. Let's investigate what Hunter Biden's doing in Ukraine and elsewhere. That's a journalistic obligation, perhaps, and an academic for academicians like us here.
Let me suggest this. There might not just simply be academic. That is to say, we have both the President of the United States, who obviously is running for re-election, right? So we want to say, well, we want to know what Ivanka's been. We want to know what Don June's doing, right? But then we also have the Vice President who's also running for the presidency. So maybe we should know about them as well. That isn't there a governmental function to look at well, let's make sure that whatever's going on, we understand.
I think Mike's right, though. It's a media function. This is the role of the media, of being a watchdog to check those things, basically. And, so far they've been doing a pretty good job of that.
The only thing you guys forget is that Obama's own State Department said that there was some question about the legitimacy or the
Appearance, I think it was.
appearance. Was that the word they used?
Yeah, appearance, yeah.
The appearance of Biden and Burisma. Because Burisma was known as a potentially bad actor.
corrupt.
Okay. And so they came forward with that. And what did the Vice President's office say? You heard it. Nothing.
Nothing at all.
They didn't. They didn't say. So here's Obama's own State Department people saying this looks really fishy and bad, and you better do something. And Biden said, "No."
Security agencies determined that there was no there there.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
this is what they did. The State Department.
Okay, that was a good investigation, I guess.
I mean, as we did talk about at the previous show, I'm very much would be in favor of that. Should policy change? Should the laws change?
I'd love to see policy change.
With regard to
Nepotism.
nepotism.
Oh, we use the
I
same
think-
word.
Yeah. So I think I agree that's a real problem out there, and that policy needs to be changed. How you proceed to do that.
How you proceed to do that with the Congress, where all of their families are involved and stuff.
Nepotism.
Nepotism. Nepotism is rampant.
Yeah.
You think in Washington?
Oh yes, I
Right.
do think. Yeah.
But anyway.
Thank you. Clearing up that problem.
We all agree on that.
That's good. So looking forward to the politics of all this. So it looks as if obviously we're going to have. It looks as if they're going to impeach. It looks like it's going to be a partisan vote. Goes to the Senate. How do you see that play into the politics of the election? Is it going to drain attention away from the Democratic candidates? Is it going to make Joe Biden look weaker, stronger? What's your sense about that? I'll start with you, Mike, and then we'll go around here.
I think, in my mind, I think that the impeachment is going to go forward, and it's going to be a good thing for the Congress to have done it, regardless of the consequences. With regard to the consequences, in terms of how this is going to play out, it so much depends upon the independent segment of the electorate, where they move, whether or not they move, and to be in favor of impeachment and expulsion from office, or they get cold feet, or they think it's a minor issue and move the other way. If it's the former, then I think we could see that Democratic candidates running for president will pick up on this and say this is clearly what the people really are in favor of. And therefore, it could become an issue that they will run on. However, if it goes negative, that it appears that impeachment is sour, then they will try to marginalize that and try to simply hammer away at the other bread and butter issues under the focus.
By the way, do you see any of the Democratic candidates, if Joe Biden continues to be ahead, might use the Ukrainian stuff, or the Hunter Biden stuff? I mean, we haven't seen it yet. And would that alienate, obviously, then a certain amount of Democratic constituency? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a really good question. My sense at this point is I doubt it. I think that they will not use it to go after Biden. I think Biden is now weakened in any case, because the media, I mean, it's out there in the ether now. So I think that's already, as I hate the phrase, but baked into the cake, I guess. Right? But so my guess would be no.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's possible if they get desperate. I mean, I think they would do it indirectly. And who knows? Maybe that has something to do with the fact that Buttigieg and Judge and moderates are sort of moving into a better position in the poll. In other words, indirectly saying, looking at Biden as sort of keeping the chaos going, basically. Make perhaps Democratic voters looking for someone a little bit more stable without some of this extra baggage that Biden has picked up as a result of this scandal. But John, we were talking a little bit off air about the pros and cons of this in the Senate. for the election. And on one hand, keeping this going in the Senate and making this occur over the course of a few weeks does suck up all the air and doesn't allow the Democratic candidates to present their ideas and how what they're going to do differently than a Republican administration, and that's not a good thing for the Democrats because as Hillary Clinton realized last election, you can't run on just criticizing the other side. You have to be able to articulate your ideas, and the Democrats are going to be hard pressed to do that if the Trump impeachment is sucking up all the air. However, on the other hand, we see that at least the last couple of recent special elections, tying yourself to Trump, Republican candidates tying themselves to Trump don't do well in some of those states, like Virginia, some of those purple states. So depending on how the Democrats are able to articulate and make the case against Trump will determine whether or not when the Democratic candidates run and when the Republican candidates run in the Senate, how will they be impacted by those hearings? And I think the more things that come out and the more witnesses that come out, especially if they bring sort of the more top-level people like Mulvaney, Pompeo, Bolton into the mix, I think that will hurt Trump. I think that will hurt the Republican brand, and I think that will benefit the Democratic presidential candidates as well as the Democratic congressional candidates going forward.
John, give you the open field.
Well, I'm glad we moved from the legal to the political. Oh, we didn't really move from the.
I guess they're entwined, right? Go ahead.
I've got a couple things to say. Obviously, number one, bread and butter. Oh, which of the Democratic candidates is talking about bread and butter issues like prescriptions and health care? No, they're talking about open borders. They're talking about taxing the wealthy. They're talking about taxing everybody to pay for stuff that nobody can afford. And so Joe Biden's not leading anymore. Oh, why is that? Does it have anything to do with the Joe Biden gaffes, the Mr. Magoo appearance that he has made multiple times? So, and that's the liberal media calling him Mr. Magoo, not Dr. Bartkovitch. So that the issues that I see going forward politically is the Republicans have a very strong candidate in Trump. Whether or not you're in the 50% that are 40% that are Democrats, the 40% that are Republicans, or the 20% that are independents, they have a strong candidate. I just don't see anybody coming forward from the Democrats that I saw on stage. I was apparently one of the very few that saw them on stage, but I was one of the few people who saw them on stage in Georgia, where they started talking about impeachment as their first topic, and I'm going, golly, I bet you a lot of people turned off at least 40% turned off as soon as they started talking about impeachment. So I think going forward, I don't see a candidate from that dais Wednesday night in Georgia who's going to be able to compete against Donald Trump. And unless some visitation by the Holy Spirit takes place, I think Trump's going to be running against a candidate that we don't know yet, that's going to be somehow picked later. And I just don't see that. I don't see how anything that the Republican Party is going to do is going to stop the Democrats from not coming forward with a candidate that can beat Trump.
Well, we have to end on that note. I will do just one thing. The thing that always I wonder about is this: is that that the vote that it takes place, if indeed there is somebody who's voting for the Democratic candidate, I get a sense will be more a vote against Donald Trump than it will necessarily be for the individual candidate. So it remains to be seen. I mean, obviously the particulars and the landscape of the election will certainly play out. But I have a feeling that the blue wave is this pushback, which has been fairly dramatic. Whether how that will play out, as no matter who the Democrats play.
It's the economy. It's the economy.
Well, it was, but I'm not so sure anymore. But anyway, that's another. But John and I will talk about that. We've been talking with John Bartkovitch. He's a local Republican here, also political science professor. Michael Hoffman, also associate political science professor, and Hoffman, both at Salisbury University. And on the phone we had Jeremy Venook. He is a research analyst with the Center for American Progress in Washington D.C. Appreciate everybody participating.
It's been fun.
Thanks, John.
We will do this next
Have we
year.
accomplished anything?
I don't know. But
Next time.
Well, we did occupy an hour's worth of air, so
It was
okay.
fun. Thank you, gentlemen.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. You can also watch Delmarva Today on PAC 14 by tuning into Comcast Channel 14 or youtube.com/PAC 14.